To show off some new features of the roads module. In an example here, what I have is I have a cave system that I built, and if we go into this cave system, you can see that it can follow and twist and turn and branch. And what I did here was something pretty simple. I just kit bashed together a bunch of rocks from a free rock set and included that in the MicroVerse browser. So if we go to the browser now, if you don't have it installed and you go to the Caves tab, you'll see that there's this DexSoft's Caves option here, and it will let you download the package. Now this is just a couple free rocks that somebody made on the asset store, but it's enough to prove the example of what you can do by kit bashing things together and using some of the MicroVerse roads features to make a cave system. These rocks themselves, they're fine. They're a little low res on the texture resolution, and some of the LODs on them are not quite correct. Like the first LOD of one of the rocks is actually higher resolution than the main rock. But since I can't fix the package itself or include it, this is enough to show off the techniques. I do suggest if you download stuff that you look through the actual content you're downloading to check for things like these to be fixed. So anyway, I wanted to show off how this works and also show off how you can build these types of systems yourself. So let me just delete the cave system I have here. Get rid of that guy. And I'm going to go ahead and drag in a cave entrance. And you'll see that this cave entrance automatically cuts the terrain. It also pulls up the terrain around it, or rather pulls down the terrain around it if we sink it. And so this makes it very easy to always get an entranceway that looks good, because all we have to do is push it back through the terrain like that and then sink it in enough that these rocks become a nice entranceway. And then just like we can do with roads, when we have this piece selected, we can double click on this piece and it will start creating a spline for us. We can go use the extension tools here and drag out more splines to create a bigger road system, or in this case, cave system. Now, we can also place like this split piece here. And this is something I have to fix right now. The content browser is not good at placing things not on terrain. So I will fix that pretty soon. But for now, I'm just going to move this guy somewhere in view. And just like with roads, we can select the spline here. And if we can get this to the other piece, it will snap into it and create our next section. And then we can grab the intersection here if we want, and move that around, and you'll see it's all connected. And we can build this nice connected cave system, which currently has no lighting. So that's pretty cool, because it means we can quickly build out cave networks. Now, the other thing that I added to the road system, I added a bunch of very small features to the road system, but this is kind of a bigger one. If we select this cave, it has a new option on it, or it really, right now, it looks like it's the width option. I might change that icon or whatever. But just like you can adjust the spline width on a spline path, on these cave systems, you can create a control point, and this will give you more than width. It'll actually give you height, and it'll give you width as well. So you can modify the size of that cave and make it get bigger in some areas versus others. And so that's really cool, just because it means you can have different size shaped caves that you're going through, connect them to pieces, and branch off and create a whole network of exploratory caves down here, which is really cool. So that's all available right now if you download from GitHub in the roads module. But let's go over how you actually set this up which is also useful for how you would set up road systems and things like that, because I haven't really covered that system in video yet. If you're just using content, we'll be coming out with more content that has caves and things like that for you to use. But if you actually want to set up your own content, I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So let me just go into my roads module here, and I'll show you how all this is set up. So I have the content for this in this third-party content third-party DexSoft, which is the name of the asset publisher, and I have the files in here. It's referencing the files in the project, which is under rock-free assets when you download them. So it doesn't have to include the actual content. This is how we do all of these content packs, is that we are able to create these little preset settings and stuff, and then if you have that pack installed, they show up in the browser for use. So if I look at this and I go into Cave Straight here, what you'll see is that this is just a bunch of meshes kit bashed together, okay? So I have these rocks with various LODs from the pack, and I've just made a space out of a bunch of these rocks, right? You know, it's just all kit bashed together. And that's basically our straight piece. And this could be a seamless mesh. It could be, you know, like the roads are. It can be a kit bash set of rocks like this. However you want to create that data is fine. And what I've done here is I've created a piece that's basically 50 meters, 50 units in size this way, and the opening is about 15 across by 10 high. 10 to 15 in different areas. So that kind of creates a nice organic structure that's big enough to walk through as a player and look pretty good. And that's it for the straight piece. It gets a little more interesting when you get into the other pieces. So let's get into those. So under the intersections folder here, I have a couple different pieces. I have a dead end, an entrance, and a split. So let's talk about the split first. The split is basically just, I took 3 of those things, kit bashed them together, you know, placed rocks and stuff to make a nice area here which splits into 3 directions, okay? And then what I have here is the connectors, and these are just these little objects. I'll have to select one. Connectors are here. They're these little basically transforms with the connector component on them, and what they do is they tell the road system when I double click on this thing, then I'm going to create a certain piece there. And the way it does this is that it has this configuration for the pieces, and this configuration is what tells it to spawn that straight piece that we've created with a spline. And these have colors, and I suggest kind of choosing a color for your pieces just so that the connectors, if you have big systems and they have lots of different connections, like on roads, you end up with, sometimes you end up with like different lane connections, for instance, for 1 lane versus 2 lane, etc. Then it's nice to color code them just so you know which pieces match when you're dragging them around. So this has 3 of these cave connectors, and what I do is I prefab the cave connector and I stick it in with everything else. So I just have a little prefab of it, so anytime I need that connection, I can drag it in. The other thing that these do is they are rotated to the facing that they want to spawn from. So essentially, if we look at, I think cave connector 1 is, oh no, that's 45 degrees, and 180. Okay, so basically these will spawn away from the z-axis. So this 180 connection is going to spawn this way. And they actually draw these little lines on them showing you which direction they're going to spawn. So if I select this one, you'll see that it's going to spawn in this direction, which is where this piece goes. And I've sunken them in just to create a little overlap to make sure there's no leaks, because again, I'm just kit bashing a bunch of rocks together to get the result that I want. So that's how these cave connections or any type of connector in the system works. And I suggest prefabbing it just so you can quickly drag them into the scene. And if you change the color of them or any future settings that these might have, they all get updated. So next, let's look at the entrance piece. Um, the entrance piece, again, it's just a bunch of kit-bashed rocks to create an entrance. And the um, back of the entrance here has a connector, and you can see it's pointing out here to spawn that straight piece off of. And I just created a nice little entrance by flipping these rocks around and stuff like that. But we want these to cut away the terrain and vegetation in the area so that it doesn't grow through the rocks. And we also want it to modify the terrain so that we get a nice scene between those things. So what I have here is I have a hole stamp that's just embedded in this object. And so you can see here, it's going to create a hole in the terrain anywhere in this area. By default, stamps are always 2D. They're essentially projections down onto the ground. So if you have a hole stamp, it's just going to, cut the ground surface infinitely down. We don't actually want that. So what we do is we height filter it. And to set the settings on the height filter, we have two of these bind height filter range to transforms. This just means that it's going to set the height filter's range property to whatever this transform height is. So if our transform is at -5, then that's what this is going to be set to. And then it also has an offset value. So what I do is I bind the bottom of the stamp to be at -5, and by just, having no offset. And then I bind the top of the stamp to be 34 meters above, which means it'll stop cutting holes at 34 meters above. And this thing is constrained to the area of the box, okay? So that makes sure the hole doesn't get cut, like if this thing was sitting up on a hill somewhere and the terrain is way below it, or something like that. Now, in practice, it's generally always going to be there, but I like setting up this just for safety. And additionally, the clear stamp, I do the same thing. And this is just used to clear away any spawned trees, details, or objects which is spawned from the overall system. So that'll clear out all the little grasses and trees and make sure that nothing interferes with that. And I made that stamp a little bit bigger here and kind of positioned it accordingly. But also set up the filter here to make it effectively a 3D stamp. So if there's, if this thing is not placed in the right place, it will still be okay. And then the final thing on here is I added a height stamp here. And I just use a little boxed height stamp to, or sorry, I think it might be a range. Yeah, it's a set to range. So that it will kind of modify the terrain right around this landing. And that is just set to min, which means that with blend mode min on, the height of the terrain is going to be the minimum of wherever this stamp is. And again, it has no texture, so it's not applying any height or anything. It's just wherever this plane is and the terrain is. So if this is above the terrain, it's not going to affect it. But when you pull it down and pull it below the terrain, it's going to pull the terrain down with it and make it line up to this landing quite nicely. So that's how I create a nice hole that automatically gets done wherever I place this piece. And that's very useful because then you don't have to go and paint a hole or, manually edit anything. The thing will just create a hole where you need it. And in this case, it's also going to clear the vegetation for you and pull the terrain to conform to the object that you're placing. Let's talk more about the actual configs here. There are two sets of configuration objects I'm going to talk about. One is just the regular configs for setting this stuff up. And so what we have here is this main config, and this is what those connection points are pointing to. And so I called this the DexSoft cave config. And if we open this guy up, you'll see that it specifies this straight entrance piece. That is what this will spawn if you by default is that first connection. So it's going to spawn this cave straight when you double click on that thing and it generates the spline, and it'll set all that up for you. And this system actually allows for overlays, and I'll show that with the road system later because I don't have any here. You choose what orientation everything is modeled on. I do all mine on Z, and you give it a model width. And this is basically the length of which it's going to repeat. And so if we go back to our straight piece here, this was modeled to be 50 meters in total size around the 0 point. Okay. And so if I go, let's see here, I got to go back to my config. So we've set it to 50 meters. That means it's going to place one of these every 50 meters along the spline. Okay. So there's a problem here, which is what happens if our spline is, say, 1.5 units long. Okay. And it doesn't it doesn't necessarily, putting a whole nother one there is going to overlap too much and cause problems because we want the spline to end, right? So you have two choices, basically. The default is not stretch to fit, which means it's just going to clip the mesh. It'll basically take all the verts and slam them at the end. And this works fine for roads where, the mesh is essentially, it's fine being clipped that way. The road itself can just end at any point. But it doesn't work so well for caves because then all of this second half of the mesh gets slammed up to the end and you end up with this like weird flat thing there. And so instead I have an option called stretch to fit. And what this is going to do is take the total length of the spline and it's going to stretch the meshes to fit in that total length. So if you have a spline that's, say, 7.5 of these straight pieces long, it's going to stretch everything just enough so that 7 of them fit into the space of 7.5. So you'll get a little bit of stretching, but it'll line up exactly. And then there's a little boost factor here you can set if you would like it to just push things over the line a little bit. So let's say, it does perfectly match it to 7.5, but you'd kind of like to give it a little extra. You can do that. I don't have to do that here because I've modeled plenty of extra into the actual kit bash, but the option is available if you want it to stretch a little more than it needs. And by the way, all of these can be created from the MicroVerse menu here. Right click, and you can create like a road material config, road system config, etc. I may put these under a folder eventually, so it's a little one more if you're watching this video later, just because it's starting to be a lot of objects instead of just a few. And the other one here is the cave system config. Okay, so the road system, it's really a road system config. The road system has a configuration with extra data on it that's just for the road system. It's not for other, other stuff. And some of the systems here include a name prefix for what you would like things to be named when you create them. So instead of being named road, they can be named cave. And it has a checkbox here for whether you allow shaping or not. Shaping is essentially that function that allowed me to scale these in X and Y. The road system does not allow shaping because it would obviously break things like lanes. You can't just, lanes don't get wider on roads as the road gets more lanes. You have to transition to something with 3 or 4 lanes. And then you can specify the size of the handle that the shaping system uses, and that's on the distance. So with these caves, the normal distance was 1 meter, and so with these caves, that meant I had to be like inside the cave to use the controls to make it bigger instead of being able to see it outside. So I added that option. And then you can set the spline paint default, which basically says, hey, if I'm using the new features to quickly paint down roads, which model should I, config should I be painting? And in this case, it's that config with the straight piece in it. And then you can set whether or not this should modify the terrain by default, because we don't want our caves to modify the terrain by default. We don't want the whole, terrain getting sunk down to the level of the cave. That would kind of defeat the purpose. And, there's a setting on every spline for you to do this on each, road piece. But we would just want the default set that way for people when we create these things. So, so that's basically the two configuration files that we have. One is for the whole system of caves, the rules and behaviors there, and the other one is for this connection. So when we double click on a connector, what do we do? And I'll come back and discuss the overlays in a moment. And finally in here I have the collection folder, and this is how you add stuff to the MicroVerse content browser. I should really do a real video on this by itself because it's useful elsewhere, but I'll quickly cover it here. The MicroVerse content browser allows you to create these configuration files and install them on a, in our case when installing MicroVerse, but you could, do this for yourself or for your art packages. And one of the things it allows you to do is have an ad that shows up when you don't have the content installed. And so essentially I have this little add image here, which is actually it should be uncompressed because it's stretching it. Let me just fix that. Let's see here. sRGB is fine. We don't want it auto-sized right here. So these images are 420 by 280, and they're used in the browser when you don't have content installed. And here we have the actual content config. It goes in the content tab, the new content tab for caves. This is its pack name and its ID. IDs you can have multiple configs, and they can all get merged into one listing if they have the same ID. And there's some stuff on here for height stamps if you want a preview gradient that's different than the one we use. And then here it points to that cave system config that we created earlier. This is letting the content browser know about this config so that when you use these new paint tools to quickly create a cave spline, it knows which one to spawn. And this just takes a generic scriptable object so that systems, new MicroVerse systems, can actually design their own configs and have them delivered with this system. You can filter by render pipeline. And then in the content here, you basically have the different different intersections here. So we have a cave entrance, a cave Y-split, and a cave dead end. And you can create preview images, and there's actually tools right in MicroVerse to do that, so you don't have to do it all in Photoshop and stuff. And you can even use a preview asset, etc. for these, and they have a stamp texture if it's a stamp texture that you're doing. So basically you fill out the contents, and then those contents show up under your configuration here. And the most interesting thing here, where is it, is there's a required object. Is it not showing? System config. Am I looking at the wrong config? It's on the add. So if the add is installed, so it has an installed object here, which is pointing to one of the rocks in this asset pack. So essentially what will happen is if this add is present, it will show, but if this installed object appears in the project, then it will show the actual collection. And this is how, when people download your asset, the content browser goes from showing an add to showing the actual content data. And the add stuff here, the pack name and ID names need to match the ones in the config. And then here is your image that it's going to display, and the download path and the asset store, in this case, to download the asset. And there's a little option box as to whether or not you require the installed option, because if you don't ship one of these to the user separately, like let's say you are building a rock collection and want to provide one of these configs, you can just provide the config and not provide the add. But if you want, you can send me the add, and then I can advertise your assets in MicroVerse as being compatible and having cool stuff that they do. And there's a little description here that shows up. So that's just a brief intro to how that system works. So let's talk about the other options in the configs. And to do that, I'm going to just look at the roads module configs because they do a lot of this. So let's look at the actual road content in the roads module here, which has so first of all, you'll notice that we have a config for each lane combination. So like here's a 2-lane. And what you'll see here is that this actually has 2 elements in it. It has a 2-way and 1-lane marking, so you can switch between having a road of 2 lanes that all goes in one direction versus one with the double yellow lines, which goes in 2 directions. So you can choose between these roads. And what you'll also see is that in here in the overlays, there's a whole bunch of these. And these are like little scenes you can set up. So for instance, we have guardrails here, and we have a whole bunch of choices for guardrails that you can spawn onto this spline automatically. And this, if you look at any of these, if we just double click one of these, what this looks like is just a little scene, and I'll do the 2-sided ones, two-sided here. Or no, sorry, LR is 2-sided. So it's just a little scene of the rails that we're going to spawn, and the little end connectors here. And these are set up with various rules. For instance, the end connectors here have a bend rule that says we only place this on the end if we are, done with the spline essentially. And then we have the same thing for the beginning. So that will cap them off. And we'll talk about bend rules a lot more in a moment. But basically, these are just little scenes without the road in them, and you can build them and add them to these different categories. And you can have any number of categories you want. So if we go back into our config for the 2-lane here, you'll see that this has a whole bunch of different guardrails, but you can just add your own categories here for like tunnels, bridge pieces, if you want to spawn, concrete bridge underneath your road. And so you can just add more and more stuff here when you're making these setups to have any kind of pre-created scene you want along the spline road. And these configs can also be done for intersections as well. So if your intersection pieces, if they want, little prefab scenes, you can dial up with, I don't know, whatever you would need in them, you can do that as well. So essentially you could take something like these prefabbed rock pieces we've been doing, create a bunch of prefab decorations for them, and then you can just dial them up really quick when you're working with them. So the final thing we should talk about is the options on the bend configuration. And I suspect these options are going to change and grow over time. So if it's been a year, expect that there's more here. So let's go back. I'm going to go back to our caves. So if we go to cave straight here and we look at this root object, we'll see that it has a bend rules script on it. Okay. Now the default for anything in the scene is to just bend it. And there's no like particular interesting rules about that. But we can change these rules to do other things. So and we can actually apply them on the rock itself if we wanted to, like hierarchical as we go. And depending on what mode you're in, you get different rules. So for instance, if I switch this to place, then it is not going to actually generate bent meshes. It's not going to bend your meshes anymore. It's just going to place rocks. So all these rocks would just get placed in their relative location around the spline. Now, the reason I don't do this is a lot cheaper than bending all the meshes, but is that in this case, it would create holes. But for things like decorations and things like that, you don't want to bend them. You don't want to bend a stop sign. You don't want to bend a torch. And plus, you don't want to pay for the memory of generating those new meshes, storing them potentially, etc. So if you switch to something like place, it's just going to place them along the orientation of the spline. You can have it rotated as well towards the facing of the spline so that they keep their relative rotation. And then you can also say that they should be placed and rotated, but not slope, meaning they shouldn't follow the slope. So like a stop sign always stays straight up. A torch is probably always mounted straight up, even if the pathway in the cave is going down. Okay. And then you could say a chance of how much chance they should spawn. There's some cap rules which are used for, like, this should only appear at the end of the spline, at the beginning of the spline. The example we saw earlier used those. And you can say basically how much of the segment needs to be left before it will spawn something. So if you're only like 10% into the segment and it's getting culled, like on a road, you might not want to spawn something there because it's too big, or you might want to or it's required left. So if there's only 10% left or whatever, it might be fine. So you can use this to basically cull things in different ways. And then there's a culling mode here, which basically says, like, okay, if I am beyond the end of the spline, do I cull the object altogether? Do I clamp it to the end? Or do I let it exist in where it would be projected out from the spline? So that lets you do things like, if we were to take these rocks and just place them instead of, and let's do place rotate, this is going to create cracks, so we're not actually going to do this. But what we don't want is to clamp all the last rocks to the end of the spline, and we don't want anything that might be a tiny bit over the end to just be culled. So instead, what it'll actually do is just project the direction of the spline and place the rock in the relative location that it would be. And then finally, with the place rules, you can do things like positional variance, rotational variance, scale variance, and tell it to scale uniform or not. So if you were placing, rocks around that, when the game activates will fall, you might scatter them, and then when the game starts, they would all fall into some nice configuration. You could do stuff like that too. So this lets you kind of noise up the placement of things. But for our use case, we're just going to use plain old Ben because that gives us the best result. So yeah, I hope this makes the system for creating these easier. It is kind of a lot of little collections if you want to put it in the browser, and then there's these scriptable objects if you want to adjust various rules, and you have these bend components. It all makes sense once you kind of get it all in your head, but it is a bunch of little details. But once you do understand it, you can build things pretty fast. And I also expect this system in Roads to have lots of changes coming as we add more types of content and explore the other things that this system can be used for further. So if it looks a little bit different, that's to be expected. And as always, I keep, documentation as updated as possible on things. And so reading the documentation will usually answer a lot of your questions. So I hope this tutorial was useful. I do think we're going to be doing some more caves, not necessarily kit-bashed ones, but ones that are actually modeled. But just being able to do this, and let me go put some lights in here too. Another thing is, like, I'm just going to create a light right now, and I'm going to just stick it at my view and give it a nice, like, let's do a nice amount of lighting. And I'm going to come in here and just duplicate these and did it duplicate? Yeah, it did. Okay, duplicate and align to view. Let me just light up this thing. So there's a lot of ways. Like, probably what I would do here is I would create some configs to put torches on the wall or whatever type of magical lighting I wanted to come up with to light the cave. And I would probably use that system, so you just dial up the lighting you want and maybe even set the default to have lighting, something like that. But you can also, you can just place stuff, but then you're placing things that are non-destructive. So what you can do is just be smart about your parenting. So if I go and I grab this cave entrance here, this first point light, I can just parent to this cave entrance. And then for the other ones, rather than parenting them, because the spline will or might clear them out. No, I think it keeps a list of messages. I think you could parent them, but you can't really parent things in a spline to Unity normally. Normally, you can't really do that because you're parenting to the spline game object. You're not parenting to position on the spline. Well, I have a thing that fixes that. It's called spline relative. Where is it? Spline relative transform. There we go. So if you were to add these to this object, and I should get multi-editing working on this since that should work. What you can do is assign it the spline. So if we take that cave 0 spline and assign it, and we do the same thing with this guy, then these lights will actually deform with this spline. So if I take my Y section here, and oops, I grabbed a rock from it, split Y, and we move them, then the lights that we placed are relative to that spline and have moved along with it. Oh, there's also a bug in Unity splines where they don't always update, and which is a little annoying, but if you click on that spline and change pretty much anything about it, it will usually update. Let's see here. Maybe it won't work with the... oh, I'm in the wrong mode. Cave 0, grab the width control. Oh, the width control won't update it either, but if I was to grab a point along that spline... yeah, there we go. It's now updated the spline to draw correctly. So that's a little bit of an annoying Unity bug there in the spline code. But you can see that all the lights are now conforming to that spline. If I select them all, there's my point lights. And why it's drawing... yeah, sometimes the Unity spline stuff just doesn't draw correctly. But you can see that the lights are actually conforming, or they're conforming to where the spline used to be, because the spline doesn't think it's changed. This might be something that I need to fix, but I'm not sure. I might have to call some kind of, you're out of sync on the spline here. But let me just go ahead and I'm going to add a control point to the spline that makes it easier to move this around, which I've recently learned you can do. Oh, did it update it? Yeah, it updated it once I went to the add mode. So I've recently learned that you can add a single control point to a spline if you can click on the spline, which is very hard to see. Again, the Unity splines need a bunch of work on real world use cases here. Like, I can barely see this spline, but if I'm lucky enough to click on it and then hit escape, I believe that will make, nope, it made a new spline. Anyway, there is a way to split this spline and give it another control point, but yeah, they don't make it easy. Anyway, you can see that once the spline actually updated, all of the point lights updated to follow it, which is pretty cool. So using that workflow, we can keep these lights in our cave regardless of changes to the spline that we make. So anyway, hope that's useful. Kind of a long tutorial, but hopefully it helps make sense of things if you're not familiar with the road system yet.